Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first installment of the celebration countdown to our 105th anniversary. I'm so thrilled to have with us today Patricia Buck Bruschi. And Patricia is the granddaughter of George B. Buck, our first chief actuary in New York City. And I'm so thrilled to have you here, Patricia. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Sherry. I'm honored to be here.
And I just, I've shared with you before, but I am such in awe of your grandfather. And I remember starting at the Office of the Actuary and just looking at these reports that he had left behind in our filing cabinet and filing room. And, they had the dates on there from, 1916, 1920s, and had his signatures on it. And I just remember holding these reports and thinking, oh my gosh, these are the same reports that George Buck held that I'm holding today. And I've read so many, works that he's done. He's published reports, and obviously there's a biography about him that's also on our website. And I've been very fascinated about him, but to hear it straight from you, I think is going to be add another level of interest to it for us, for me and our viewers.
So. Well, thank you. Just remember, my perspective is from when I was 16 and below. I wished I had been able to know him longer. Yeah. But unfortunately, he passed away when I was about 16.
Those questions that people always ask, like if you could have lunch or sit down and have coffee with somebody dead or alive, who would it be? And I would say George Buck is one of those people.
Yeah, in my family, he was the kingpin. Yes.
Yeah. So, let's let our viewers get to know George Buck a little bit more. So George Buck worked from 1916 to 1956 for the city of New York. He did some commission work for them before he was officially chief actuary. And, could you let us know, how many mayors he worked for? Because that's kind of our gauge as each of us chief actuaries are working in our roles.
Yes, Sherry, over his history of 40 years working for the city of New York, he worked through 9 mayors.
Yeah.
He had really amazing experiences with people like Wagner and LaGuardia and O'Dwyer.
And that might be a record for the chief actuaries of how many mayors they got to work for. And this was even during a time before term limits. So it wasn't like the mayors were limited to 8 years.
Yes, there would be even more. Yeah.
Yeah. So, tell us a little, do you remember any memories or do you have any stories about your grandfather, as he was serving as the chief actuary for New York City?
Well, I remember he had 3 principles in designing pensions, and they may still exist today, but he believed that there should be joint contributions between employers and employees, that all monies collected should be placed on a reserve basis so that they would be invested and that the pensions could become self-sustaining. And he believed that all employees should have uniform benefits, public employees.
Yeah. And the
city of New York.
Those principles definitely are still in play today. And in fact, the third principle that you mentioned, that the pension benefits within the city should be uniform, that was a premise to him helping set up the first retirement system for the city of New York. And that was the teachers' retirement system. And he was saying, instead of having all these different benefits, to have something that's more uniform and defined, and having everything be so that it's not in pieces, right? So that everything is uniform.
Exactly. And now I'm very thankful because I'm the recipient of the New Jersey State Teachers Pension, which he helped set up. And I say, gee, thanks, Dad, which we called him.
Yeah. Comes full circle. And then the pre-funding too. I mean, that was part of his work when he was commissioned by the city before he was officially the chief actuary for the city of New York. Pension plans at that time weren't pre-funded. They were just kind of pay as you go. So that was definitely one of his recommendations that we still do today. We pre-fund.
And not credit to New York City.
Yeah. And not only do we pre-fund, but it's written into state statute that the city of New York has to put in what the actuary determines. So on behalf of all the public servants in New York, I do thank your grandfather for those important principles.
I'm sure he'd be very happy with that compliment.
Yeah. Is there outside of work, could you tell us a little bit more about your grandfather in terms of, what were his hobbies, what his personalities were like, or anything else that you want to share?
Sure. Um, his personality was reserved at first, but he really enjoyed a good joke. So if you were invited for dinner, you better come armed with a good joke because that really scored points in his book. Um, he was a fun grandfather in that he had many interests that we could just observe. He was a master woodcrafter. He did an exact replica of a Chippendale chair that was part of a dining set at his home. I remember seeing that and going, wow, you can't even tell the difference. He was an avid boater. He had an Elcro cruiser that he'd take out on Long Island Sound, and he'd take his grandchildren for cruises, and we'd have dinner on board. And that was a big thing. And we'd gather in the basement of his house. One side was his shop, which was all meticulously laid out with the forge and lathes and everything. And the other side was what they used to call a rumpus room. And they had a billiard table and a Wurlitzer jukebox and have all the old songs and some Brazilian songs on. And so we dance, and I dance on his feet and just play billiards and have a good time. Sometimes we go outside and play croquet.
Yeah. And so you mentioned woodwork, that he was really talented in it. And in the biography that's also on our website, I mentioned earlier, it talks about how George Buck built some of the furniture that was used in the office of the actuary at that time.
I can believe that. He was frugal and he enjoyed it. He really did enjoy woodworking.
A true actuary, a frugal actuary, a frugal person.
Yes.
And how would you think your grandfather would want to be remembered? And what do you think he would want his legacy to have been?
I think he would like people to think of him as a humanitarian, a wise and thoughtful decision maker, besides being frugal, and an inclusive person. He paid women the same as men, and I am very proud of that. And also, he hired all ethnicities, which was not the case in those days. And to his credit, that was his credo. He believed that people should be treated well and fairly. Mm-hmm. I think he especially cared about public employees. They should have a fair pension, and they should be protected if they have a perilous job, such as in those days it was street sweepers who were getting injured, and of course police and firefighters. So, I'm really happy that I've read more about him since I've gotten older and understood why he spent so much time at his job, and it was so important to him as a person.
Yeah. And everything I've heard about your grandfather, everything I've read about him, he was such a man ahead of his times. We talked about the report that the pillars and the recommendations he made to the city about the pension plans. And like I said, they're still in use right now. In addition to that, his forward thinking of pay equity and hiring a diverse staff. I mean, this is what we are talking about in 2021, 105 years later.
Yes, that's quite a compliment.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that things are still going along, ticking along somewhat as he started.
Yeah. And so your father, who was also named George Buck, George B. Buck Jr., he was an actuary as well. And he was the president of the Conference of Consulting Actuaries in 1967, I believe. And so, do you know that if, George Buck Sr. had mentored him into being an actuary, or, if he were to mentor future actuaries, what kind of advice would he have?
Absolutely. Yes. I think, teaching was always part of his credo, to pass on his knowledge and to include somebody who was interested in learning more about the position. So definitely my father went in after he served his term in the Navy as a commander of a destroyer escort. He made a big switch to become an actuary for Buck Consultants, which was started later as there are more demands for his skills in other areas. So they carried that business on for a long time, and it's still going. So I'm proud of that too.
And if you were to mentor, future chief actuaries or aspiring chief actuaries, what do you think some of his advice would be?
What do I think he would say
Mm-hmm.
to future actuaries? Well, just, the things that I mentioned, to be thoughtful,
Mm-hmm.
decisive, frugal, and to think about the needs of the people you serve by these pensions as real people and what needs they have, such as accidental death and dismemberment included with a pension if you have a hazardous position.
Mm-hmm.
So
Definitely.
just to carry on all those thoughts.
Yeah. And you mentioned Buck Consulting, which was the company that your grandfather started and your father worked at. Still a company that's a global company that's around right now and today in 2021, and is our actuarial consultants, is the Office of the Actuaries outside consultants right now. And so you said you recall visiting your grandfather's office when he was working.
Yes, they got the first computer, which was huge, and it had its own room with, cool temperature control, and everybody was rejoicing that they didn't have to do hand calculations and
Mm-hmm.
all that. So yeah, that was the prototype.
Yeah.
Now.
The early days. And I heard your grandfather has a nickname.
Yes, I was lucky enough to be able to give him the nickname because I moved right in as a newborn into his home in Larchmont because my mother was without her husband. He was off in the war. And so my first words when I saw him was Dada. And so that became Dada, or as you can say, DATA, data, which is a familiar actuarial term. So everybody in the family called him Dada.
Okay. So we should call him Grandpa Data in our office.
The legacy of data, and you have plenty of data.
Yeah. Well, Patricia, thank you for taking the time to be with us and to talk with me today.
You're very welcome, Sherry, and much success to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I know, like I said, I look up to your grandfather a lot, just from everything I learned about him. So I'm sure our viewers were very appreciative of you sharing some of these personal stories with them too. So
thank you so much for allowing me to do this.
thank you.